Margaret Sullivan adjusted her reading glasses as she reviewed the quarterly reports from her company's Seattle branch office. At 72, she had built tech flow solutions from a small startup in her garage to a multinational corporation with over 50,000 employees worldwide. The rain tapped gently against the windows of her downtown penthouse office as she studied the employee satisfaction surveys with growing concern. "Do, something's not right here," she murmured, setting down the papers that revealed troubling patterns of workplace discrimination at the Seattle location. Margaret had always believed in treating every employee with dignity and respect, values that had guided her company's growth for decades. But these reports suggested her newest acquisition was operating under a completely different philosophy. The idea came to her during her morning walk through Pike Place Market. She watched vendors interact with customers of all ages, treating everyone equally regardless of appearance or social status. The elderly fishmonger received the same warm greeting as the young tech worker. And Margaret realized she needed to see firsthand how her own company was treating people. That evening, she made a decision that would have shocked her board of directors. Using her maiden name and a different phone number, Margaret called the Seattle office. "This is Margaret Thompson," she said, deliberately softening her authoritative tone. "I saw your job posting for a receptionist position online, and I'm very interested in applying." The scheduler on the other end sounded bored and slightly dismissive. "How old are you, ma'am?" the young woman asked bluntly. "I'm 72, but I'm very capable and eager to work," Margaret replied honestly. There was a pause before the scheduler reluctantly offered her an appointment. "Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Don't be late, and bring references." Margaret spent the weekend preparing for her undercover mission. She visited a thrift store in Ballard, selecting modest clothing that would help her blend in as someone seeking employment out of financial necessity. She practiced speaking with a slightly different accent and created a detailed background story about being a widow who needed supplemental income to make ends meet. The role felt strange after decades of commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. But Margaret was determined to uncover the truth about her company's culture. If discrimination was happening at TechFlow, she would root it out personally. Tuesday morning arrived with typical Seattle drizzle that painted the city in shades of gray. Margaret took the bus instead of her usual private car, experiencing the morning commute like any ordinary job seeker. She sat quietly among commuters, many of whom were heading to jobs at tech companies throughout the city, and wondered how many elderly workers had been overlooked or dismissed simply because of their age. The TechFlow building rose 30 stories above Pioneer Square, its glass facade reflecting the storm clouds gathering overhead. Margaret had been proud when her company purchased this prime real estate 2 years earlier, but now she approached it with entirely different eyes. The imposing structure suddenly seemed cold and unwelcoming. The lobby was impressive, featuring modern furniture and digital displays showcasing company achievements and awards. However, Margaret immediately noticed how the security guard barely acknowledged her presence as she signed the visitor log. While he warmly greeted a younger visitor who arrived moments later. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to TechFlow," the guard said enthusiastically to the well-dressed man behind her. When Margaret approached the reception desk, the young woman sitting there looked up from her computer with obvious annoyance. Her nameplate read, "Ashley," and her perfectly styled blonde hair framed a face that showed clear disdain for the elderly woman standing before her. "I'm here for a job interview," Margaret said quietly, clutching her modest purse with hands that had signed million-dollar contracts. "Margaret Thompson, 2 o'clock appointment." Ashley's expression shifted to one of surprise, mixed with mild disgust. "Oh, you're the receptionist applicant," she replied, her tone suggesting she couldn't believe someone Margaret's age would dare apply for such a position. "I wasn't expecting someone so mature. Take a seat over there by the window. Someone will get to you when they have time." Margaret walked to the designated waiting area, observing the office dynamics around her with the keen eye of someone who had spent decades managing people. She watched as employees hurried past, their gazes sliding over her as if she were invisible furniture. A group of young professionals gathered near the elevators, their laughter echoing through the lobby as they made jokes she couldn't quite hear, but whose dismissive tone was unmistakable. 25 minutes past her scheduled appointment time, a man in his 30s, wearing an expensive charcoal suit, approached her section of the lobby. His hair was perfectly styled, and his shoes probably cost more than many people's monthly rent. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice carrying the practiced politeness of someone accustomed to dealing with inconvenience. "I'm Brad Mitchell, Human Resources Manager. Sorry for the delay. We had some important client calls that ran over." His handshake was brief and perfunctory, the kind of gesture that conveyed professional obligation rather than genuine courtesy. Margaret noticed how his eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her, as if he were already mentally dismissing her candidacy. "Follow me to the conference room," Brad said, turning and walking briskly toward the elevators without checking if she could keep up with his pace. Margaret followed, her comfortable walking shoes making soft sounds on the polished marble floor as she wondered how many other older applicants had received this same treatment in her company's name. The conference room was sterile and intimidating, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, where ferries moved slowly through the gray water. Brad shuffled through papers while Margaret settled into her chair, feeling the weight of decades of business experience behind her carefully maintained facade of humble desperation. "So, Mrs. Thompson," Brad began without looking up from his documents, "it says here you're 72 years old. That's quite seasoned for someone seeking employment in our fast-paced, technology-driven environment. Are you absolutely certain you can handle the demands of a modern workplace?" Margaret folded her hands carefully in her lap, the same hands that had once shaken hands with presidents and CEOs. "I believe experience and dedication can be valuable assets to any organization, Mr. Mitchell. I'm here because I genuinely need the work, and I'm willing to learn whatever systems you use." Before Brad could respond, the conference room door opened and his assistant entered, carrying a tablet and wearing a barely concealed smirk. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with the confidence that comes from never having experienced workplace discrimination. "Sorry I'm late, Brad," she said, deliberately ignoring Margaret's presence. "Traffic on I-5 was absolutely insane this morning." She glanced at Margaret and added with obvious disdain, "Oh, we're still interviewing the charity cases today? I thought we'd moved past that phase." Brad chuckled at his assistant's comment without offering any correction or apology. "Jennifer will be observing today's interview process," he explained to Margaret, though his tone suggested he didn't feel the need to justify his assistant's rudeness. "Now, Mrs. Thompson," Brad continued, "tell me honestly about your computer skills. Can you actually operate modern software and equipment? Or are you more comfortable with traditional methods like typewriters and filing cabinets?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "I have basic computer knowledge and experience with email and internet usage. I'm always eager to learn new systems and adapt to whatever tools your company uses." Jennifer whispered something to Brad that made him chuckle again. Margaret caught fragments of words like outdated and hopeless case, and felt a growing anger that she forced herself to suppress. She had built this company on principles of respect and inclusivity, yet here were her own employees demonstrating exactly the opposite values. "The thing is, Mrs. Thompson," Brad said, leaning back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real adversity, "our receptionist position requires someone who can represent our company's innovative culture and cutting-edge approach to business. We need someone who can connect with our predominantly young, dynamic clientele." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Our clients expect to see fresh faces that reflect the modern tech industry. No offense, but you might be more comfortable in a different type of work environment." Margaret maintained her composure even as she watched these employees systematically demolish everything she had tried to build. I understand your concerns, but I believe good customer service transcends age. People appreciate courtesy and efficiency regardless of who provides it. Brad exchanged a meaningful look with Jennifer before responding. Listen, Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's be realistic here. This job involves operating multiple computer systems simultaneously, managing digital calendars, coordinating video conferences, and maintaining our social media presence. These are skills that typically come more naturally to younger generations. Are you saying older workers can't learn technology? Margaret asked, her voice remaining steady despite the anger building inside her. And I'm saying that in today's competitive marketplace, companies need employees who can hit the ground running without extensive training periods, Brad replied dismissively. We simply don't have time to teach basic technological literacy to workers who should have learned these skills decades ago. Jennifer laughed openly at this comment. Besides, can you imagine trying to explain our project management software to someone who probably still uses a flip phone? It would be like teaching my grandmother to use TikTok. Margaret watched as these young employees continued their casual demolition of human dignity, all while sitting in a building that existed because of her vision, her work, and her decades of sacrifice. The irony was almost overwhelming, but she knew she needed to see how far this behavior extended before revealing her true identity. The interview continued for another 15 minutes, with Brad and Jennifer taking turns asking increasingly condescending questions about her ability to adapt to their high-energy work environment and whether she could physically handle sitting at a desk for 8 hours. They questioned her stamina, her hearing, her eyesight, and her ability to remember complex instruction. Mrs. Thompson, Brad finally said, gathering his papers with the finality of someone ending an unpleasant obligation. I think we've heard enough. While we appreciate your interest in TechFlow solutions, it's clear that this position isn't the right fit for someone with your limitations. Jennifer nodded in agreement. You might want to consider opportunities more suited to your demographic. Maybe something in retail or food service where the expectations are more manageable. Margaret felt decades of careful control beginning to slip away. These people were not just disrespecting her personally. They were systematically destroying the values and culture she had spent her entire career building. But she forced herself to maintain her role for just a few more moments. I see, she said quietly. And what exactly do you perceive as my limitations, Mr. Mitchell? Brad seemed surprised by the directness of her question. Well, obviously your age makes you unsuitable for a dynamic, technology-focused workplace. Our company needs people who can adapt quickly to change and represent our forward-thinking brand image. So you're telling me that TechFlow Solutions discriminates against employees based on age? Margaret asked, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge that both Brad and Jennifer failed to know. Or we don't discriminate, Jennifer interjected defensively. We just have realistic expectations about what different types of people can contribute to our organization. Margaret stood slowly from her chair, drawing herself up to her full height as decades of authority began to reassert themselves. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Though Brad and Jennifer remained oblivious to the change occurring before their eyes, I want to make sure I understand your position correctly, Margaret said, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone accustomed to boardroom confrontations. You believe that TechFlow Solutions should only hire young employees because older workers are inherently less capable, less trainable, and less valuable to the organization. Brad shifted uncomfortably, sensing something different in Margaret's demeanor but unable to identify what had changed. Look, Mrs. Thompson, this isn't personal. It's just business reality in the modern economy. Margaret reached into her modest purse and withdrew her phone, a latest model device that seemed incongruous with her carefully constructed image of technological incompetence. Both Brad and Jennifer noticed the expensive phone, but seemed confused by this detail that didn't fit their assumption. "Before I leave," Margaret said, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority, "I'd like to ask you both a question. Do you know who owns TechFlow Solution?" Brad laughed nervously. "Of course. The company was founded by Margaret Sullivan back in the 1980s. She's some old lady who got lucky in the tech boom." "Why?" Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the building, and the expression transformed her entire face. "Because, Mr. Mitchell, I am Margaret Sullivan, and you have just demonstrated exactly why this company is failing to live up to the values I spent 40 years building." The silence that followed was deafening. Brad's face went through several colors, settling on a pale green that matched the Seattle sky outside the conference room window. Jennifer's tablet slipped from her hands and clattered onto the table, the sound echoing in the suddenly airless room. "Hey, that's impossible," Brad whispered, his voice barely audible. "Margaret Sullivan is old?" Margaret suggested, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority. "Apparently too old to work for my own company, according to your professional assessment." Jennifer opened and closed her mouth several times without producing any sound, looking like a fish gasping for air. The confident young woman who had been making jokes about elderly workers just moments before now seemed to be having difficulty breathing. Margaret walked to the window overlooking Elliott Bay, her entire posture having shifted from humble job seeker to commanding executive. "For 40 years, I built this company on the principle that every person deserves respect and opportunity, regardless of their age, gender, race, or background. I created TechFlow Solutions to be different from the discriminatory practices I witnessed throughout my early career." She turned back to face the two employees who had just unknowingly destroyed their own careers. "What I've witnessed here today represents everything I fought against when I was building this company. You have systematically humiliated and dismissed a job candidate based solely on age-related prejudices." Brad found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Ms. Sullivan, we had no idea. If we had known—" "If you had known what, Mr. Mitchell?" Margaret interrupted. "If you had known my identity, you would have treated me with respect. But that elderly woman who walked in here an hour ago didn't deserve basic human dignity simply because you assumed she was powerless." Margaret moved to the conference table and placed both hands on its surface, leaning forward with the intensity that had made her legendary in business circles. "Every day, hundreds of older workers face exactly the treatment you gave me today. They don't have the privilege of revealing themselves as company owners. They simply absorb your discrimination and walk away, their dignity damaged and their economic security threatened." Jennifer finally found her voice, though it shook with obvious panic. "Miss Sullivan, please, we didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to reveal your true attitudes toward older workers?" Margaret asked. "You didn't mean to demonstrate the toxic culture that has infected this office? You didn't mean to violate both company policy and federal employment law?" Margaret straightened and walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "Both of you will clean out your desks immediately. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. Your final paychecks will include severance pay as required by law, which is more courtesy than you showed me today." "But Ms. Sullivan," Brad pleaded, desperation clear in his voice, "surely we can discuss this. Everyone makes mistakes. I have a mortgage, a family." Margaret turned back to face him, her expression showing no mercy. "Mr. Mitchell, did you consider whether the elderly woman you just humiliated might have financial obligations? Did you wonder if she might have family depending on her income? Did you show any concern for her dignity or well-being?" The question hung in the air unanswered, because everyone in the room knew the truth. Brad and Jennifer had shown no consideration for Margaret's circumstances, because they had written her off as worthless from the moment she walked through the door. Margaret opened the conference room door and stepped into the hallway, where several employees had gathered after hearing raised voices. Word of her presence was already spreading through the office, and she could see shock and fear on faces throughout the workspace. "I want every employee in this office to understand something clearly," Margaret announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the floor. "Age discrimination has no place at TechFlow Solutions. Treating any person with disrespect based on their age, appearance, or perceived social status is unacceptable and will result in immediate termination." She walked through the office space, making eye contact with employees who had ignored her just hours earlier. "This company was built on principles of inclusion and respect. If you cannot embrace those values, you cannot work here. Anyone who has witnessed or participated in discriminatory behavior has exactly one opportunity to come forward and make it right." Margaret paused at Ashley's reception desk, where the young woman was now visibly trembling. "Ms. Ashley, your treatment of visitors to this office reflects directly on TechFlow's reputation. Do you understand that every person who walks through that door deserves professional courtesy?" Ashley nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry, Ms. Sullivan. I'll do better, I promise." "You'll have that opportunity," Margaret replied, "but understand that this is your only warning. Disrespect toward visitors, regardless of their age or appearance, will not be tolerated." Margaret made her way to the elevator, surrounded by employees who were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. As the elevator doors opened, she turned back to address the office one final time. "TechFlow Solutions will continue to thrive because we value wisdom, experience, and the contributions of workers at every stage of their careers. Age is not a limitation. Prejudice is. I built this company to prove that success comes from respecting human potential, not from discriminating against it." The elevator doors closed, leaving behind an office full of employees who would never again make assumptions about older workers. Margaret rode down to the lobby in silence, feeling both exhausted and vindicated. She had exposed a serious problem in her company's culture, but she had also demonstrated that ageism would not be tolerated. As she walked through the lobby toward the exit, Margaret noticed that Ashley was already making apologetic phone calls, probably to elderly job candidates who had been dismissed or discouraged. The security guard, who had ignored her earlier, now stood at attention and offered a respectful goodbye. Outside, the Seattle rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds over Elliott Bay. Margaret stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching people hurry past on their way to jobs and appointments. She thought about all the older workers who face discrimination every day without having the power to fight back. Her phone buzzed with messages from executives who had already heard about the incident. News traveled fast in the corporate world, and by tomorrow, the story would probably be discussed in business schools as an example of how ageism could destroy company culture. But Margaret wasn't thinking about corporate lessons or media attention. She was thinking about the conversation she would have with her board of directors about implementing stronger anti-discrimination policies and training programs. She was planning the company-wide memo that would reinforce TechFlow's commitment to age inclusivity. Most importantly, she was considering how to ensure that no elderly job seeker would ever again face the humiliation she had experienced today. As Margaret walked toward the bus stop, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. She had built TechFlow Solutions to be better than the discriminatory companies of her youth, and today she had proven that those values were worth fighting for, even at 72 years old. The bus arrived, and Margaret climbed aboard among the evening commuters. Tomorrow, she would return to her executive role, but she would never forget the lessons learned from spending one afternoon as just another elderly job seeker facing the casual cruelty of ageism in America's modern workplace.